terrible battles of trying to get people free of alcohol addiction, drug addiction, crime addiction, heal health, and trying to get them out of that circle of deprivation is fairly wearing.
Yeah. So we've heard about the kind of the benefit system and how people are struggling with that. I mean, that's a national issue. I remember sitting down with the Bishop of Lewis recently, and I asked him the question, what's the issue you'd most like to tackle? And he said, taking on universal credit and the way it runs. And I said, you've not got hope. You've not got hope. But if, I said, the Anglican Church, with all of the relationships that it's got, could come together in some coordinated way, then maybe you would.
Yeah.
Then maybe you would. We heard about the asylum, the story of poor housing. I mean, I know I was sat with a woman a few months ago in Lewisham called Christine, who, she wasn't an asylum seeker, but she had, her children were in one bedroom. They had like 3 bunk beds high, stacked, so there were 6 children in one room, and there was black mold all over the place. And she said her 6-year-old boy was so frightened at night that the black monster would get him, that he would go into her room and sleep with her. But she was terrified of doing anything because she was worried that the landlord would evict her. We've got similar stories of asylum seekers who don't want to speak out because they're worried that they're going to lose that possibility of being safe and secure in their own environment. But what would it look like if we could bring those people together? Because often the problem is people feel powerless when they're on their own. But actually, if you stand together with people, you feel stronger. You feel that you are able to tell your story. And in a minute, I'll tell you the powerful story of a young person who told their story about an issue like that. And because they were in relationship with so many other people, because they were working with so many other people, they had the courage and the dignity to be able to step forward and tell their story and do something about it. And then we heard about young people. I mean, in London at the moment, it's all that's on everybody's lips, is the kind of the challenge of, yes, youth aspiration, but also crime amongst young people in particular. And we've got to ask ourselves, what role does the church have to play? What could it play? And there's a really exciting thing going on in London at the moment where the Anglican Church is saying, we do have a role to play, but it's not our role on our own. We want to work with other people and with the Mayor of London to think about how do we support the police and the other services to be able to do what they're doing well. So lots of issues. And I suppose the challenge with those injustices is we can only change them if we have the power to be able to do so. So in the case of universal credit, if we can compel the Prime Minister to change her mind, it seems almost impossible. And the Anglican Church, obviously, and throughout Christendom, had an awful lot of power and influence. An awful lot of power and influence. But that power, in some ways, has changed. And I think that's something exciting. It's not the kind of power that it was before, it's a different sort of power. And when I say, in order to make change, we need power, I'm not talking about dominant power, power over. I'm talking about the power of relationships. I'm talking about the power of people working together to make change. And it strikes me that that's much more like it was in the early church. It's much more actually like a deanery where you've got several committed people coming together, thinking about what could we do together to make change. As an individual, it's impossible. As a church on our own, maybe it's impossible. But when we work together and when we work with others, we build this relational power. And I think, an example of this, and why I think the kind of power that Jesus wants people to have is the power of working together, is if you remember in the temptation narrative, he's asked do you want all of these kingdoms? All of these kingdoms could be yours. Do you remember that bit in the temptation narrative? And he says no. Now, there's loads of reasons he says no. But does anybody remember what's the very next thing that happens after the temptation narrative? The devil departs. So after the wilderness, he calls the 12 disciples. Remember, he calls the 12 disciples. So it's like, so that was a mean test, wasn't it? To see if it's just checking you're awake still. He calls the 12 disciples, and I think it's partly because what Jesus is saying is, I don't want to change the world on my own. I could. I want to do it with people. And I'm going to call these 12 disciples, and we all know about the 12 disciples and, the fact they weren't necessarily the most talented people in the world. And he calls them together and he says, we're going to change the world. We're going to do it through relationship. We're going to do it through people. And the early church is born. So it's a power with rather than a power over. It's relationships, the power of relationships. It's not a dominant power, it's a relational power. I think it's the sort of power that Jesus would have been comfortable with, indeed was comfortable with. So what does it look like? I want to ask Tim, actually, to come and tell us a story about what does this relational power look like when we're building relationships with people in our local community to tackle the injustice that we see. And once he's told that story, I'll tell another one. So Tim's going to tell a kind of local story about how these relationships work and what it looks like, which I think involves young people. Yeah. And then I'll tell a story about nationally, actually, how we can begin to influence some of the things that we've talked about.
And it consists of churches, schools, mosques, university, and it's a really valuable cluster of community groups who come together to find the best way to bring the change that local people need in our city. We've spoken this afternoon about the big changes like the universal credit that many of our people would need to make their lives better, but that feels almost too big. So you've got to start small, because most of us have learned that we are powerless, that we've learned that we can't make a difference, and so we talk about how we could make the world a better place. We talk about how it could be better, but we don't know what we could do, or even feel that we could even begin. And the delight of being part of a kind of broad-based alliance like that has been that we have opportunities to help people to discover that they are the very people who can make a difference. We have an annual cycle, and it begins with deep listening. So we listen to the people from their local communities, and we find out what their big issues, their problems are. And in this particular case that I'm talking about, it was the young people, it was the children who said that what we find most difficult is that when we go to school on our bikes or on our foot, the pathways in Milton Keynes, we call them the redways, are dangerous. They're damaged, they're broken, you can't ride your bike over it, they feel unsafe, the lights in the underpasses aren't on, and we just don't want to go. We would like that to be better. And so hearing this from a number of different schools, all the other communities and the churches and the mosques were saying, well, what can we do together to help make this happen? And the great thing is that once you've got all of those groups coming together, you've actually got power to make a difference. People take you seriously. So some of the big corporate headquarters in the city say, "Oh, we'll help. We'll go for a walk with you and tidy up some litter. We'll add our name to what you want to do." And we had enough power, enough presence to be able to go to the leader of the council and say, would you meet these young people, these children? And they had the joy, a little group of them, about a dozen, meeting the council leader in his office and explaining to him what the problem was, and then organising a huge meeting with 300 kids from primary schools, all gathered together in a little square,